Shalom, everyone. Happy spring. Unless you live in Maine, then you got snow. And I guess they got snow up in a lot of places up north. But anyway, no snow here. So Santa Claus will have to wait. I'm going to try to cover something that I found fascinating. And that's why I decided for a couple of weeks we're going to do something that I find interesting. And so I'm going to talk to you about the Nephilim, which some translate as simply as giants. Now, the book that I'm using for my guide is called First Enoch. And right now I like George W.E. Nicholsberg and James C. Vanderkam the best because of some of their highlights and their notes that are in it. But I want to read to you the introduction, because I think it'll give you an understanding of why it's important to learn this one. It begins by saying, the words of the blessings with which Enoch blessed the righteous chosen, who will be present on the day of tribulation, to remove all the enemies, and the righteous will be saved. Did you hear that? Those blessed righteous ones, those chosen ones who will be here during the tribulation. Misses the idea of rapture in here. And he took up his discourse, and he said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, who had a vision of the Holy One of the heavens, with which he showed me from the words of the watchers and the holy ones, I heard everything. And I heard everything from them. I also understood what I saw. Not for this generation do I expound. Not for this generation do I expound. But this is concerning the distant times that I'm speaking to. The great Holy One will come forth from his dwelling, and the Eternal One will tread upon Mount Sinai. He will appear with his army, and he will appear with his mighty host of the heavens. And all the watchers will fear and quake, and those who are hiding in all the ends of the earth will sing, and all the ends of the earth will be shaken, and the trembling and the great fear will seize them, and the watchers unto the ends of the earth, the high mountains will be shaken, and fall and break apart, and the high hills will be made low, and melt like wax before the fire. The earth will be wholly rent asunder. Everything on the earth will perish, and there will be judgment on all. And the righteous he will make peace, and over the chosen there will be protection, and upon them will be mercy. They will all be God's, and he will grant them his good pleasure. He will bless them all, and he will help them all. Light will shine upon them, and he will make peace with them. Look, he comes with the myriads of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to destroy all the wicked, and to convict all humanity for the wicked deeds that they have done, and the proud and the hard words that wicked sinners spoke against him. Our story tonight, I guess, is a continuation of Daniel. And I say that because what drew me to the book of Enoch was the understanding of what's called watchers. You see, in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, Daniel talks about watchers. And I'd always read over that word. I'd never seen it before. In fact, let me read it to you. It comes from Daniel 4:13. I saw the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was ire, or, depending on how you pronounce the vowels, or a watcher and a holy one coming down from the heavens. So the watcher and the holy one are two different people, and both were coming down. So you can find him again in 4:17 and 4:23 because he uses the word again over and over again. And remember, when I was teaching you, Daniel, the one thing that I wanted to just point out was that this was probably one of the very first Apocrypha books that were dealing with not the days of Ezekiel, but all the way to the end of days. That's what it was working on. And so I wanted to understand more about it. Now, in Irim, which is a group called angels or called watchers, is an Aramaic word. The book of Enoch was written in Aramaic. Now, much of Enoch was lost. In fact, there's going to be a period of time of almost several hundred years between basically the 400s and the late to middle 1800s. There will be no book of Enoch. It'll be found by one group in Ethiopia, but it'll be written in a Ethiopian dialect called Gedz. Then there's another copies that were found at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those were only partial scrolls, but they were on Hebrew. But then there was another set of scrolls that were found in Europe, and they were Slavic and Greek. So there's several different kinds of writings, but the one thing that they all had in common was they basically all began the same way. They all gave credit to God and gave credit to a character called Enoch. Now, the Enoch that we're talking about here is a pseudonym. This is not the Enoch that lived back in the earliest generations. He's not the seventh son from Adam, but he uses that name in order to drive across the point of what we're going to be talking about. It's as though he was taking himself back in time and then going forward from there. And so he's looking into the future as he goes by. And so we're watching lots of things. Most scholars today would say that what we're talking about a watcher is being an angel. But there's also other disagreements. In fact, the last time I remember reading the book of Genesis in a church, the pastor told me that these characters called giants came from righteous, or actually judges, wealthy men, and that the evil people were actually Cain's kids. And so that was where it came from. But as I'm reading this, I find myself drawn away from that and back to what most Jews early on thought. You see, they originally thought that this was talking about a group of angels. Now, these angels probably got their start in the book of Genesis way back when. And they were there originally assigned for the purposes of helping, teaching, giving vital information to the people. Because remember, there is no Bible, there is no handy book around, so they gathered their information from the angels. But the angels themselves became polluted, if you will, or changed. And that's where we're going to go to next week. But right now, I just want you to understand that we're talking about the fact that this whole book that we're talking about was here, was lost, has now been found, and now is providing plenty of information for scholars to look at. We're going to be looking at lots of different kinds of information as we go through it. Originally, I said the Jews appreciated the book and took it in, but it didn't make the canon. And the reason it didn't make the canon was because of the fact that at the same point in time, the Christians were beginning to adopt the book of Enoch. Well, if the Christians are reading it, the Jews can't. And so it became unlawful to read it. In fact, Shimon Bar Yochai, who was one of the great Kabbalists of his day, told everyone that you would go to hell, you would burn in fire if you read the book of Enoch. And so the book of Enoch died in the Jewish communities. But at the same time, the Christians began to pick it up. And the reasons they picked it up is because of the book of Jude. You see, the book of Jude quotes Enoch. The book of Peter, 1st and 2nd, both of them speak about the times, but they don't quote it directly. The book of Revelations, the 4 Gospels, hint at parts of the book of Enoch. Enoch is a book that has a lot to offer the New Testament. And so with the change of a word here and there, and the word that they change is the word Son of Man. You see, they took the Son of Man and reapplied it to the Lord or to JC. But originally that was not what it was for, but it was for those characters like Ezekiel, or like Daniel, like Enoch, like Eliyahu, Elijah. Those were the characters who would be assigned the category Son of Man. As we're going through this, there's a whole lot that I need to talk to you about. Excuse me. I want you to turn with me to the book of Genesis, and we're going to start at the beginning. So I want you to go to Genesis chapter 5, and we're going to read 18 to 24. Now that covers all of the section on Enoch, but I want you to understand that there's a lot to the story that we really need to look at. If you're there, let's go. And Jared lived 162 years and begot Enoch. Jared lived after he had begotten Enoch 800 years, and he had begotten sons and daughters. Now all the days of Jared were 962 years, and then he died. And Enoch lived 65 years, and he begot Methuselah. Now, the word Methuselah, or we call him Methuselah, the interpretation of that word is his death sends. Met is the word for death. His death sends. What does his death send? It sent the flood. So keep that in your mind, because as we're going through the book of Enoch, and we're going through the Watchers section, you're going to find out that that is an important understanding. When does the flood come? After the death of Enoch, or after the death of Methuselah. Enoch walked with his God after he had begotten Methuselah 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer, for God had taken him. 365, an interesting number. We say there's 365 days in a year. In the calendar that Enoch worked with was the Essene calendar, which was a solar calendar, and they believed that the solar calendar should be 364 days. 360 days, equal numbers, 2 days for the vernal, 2 days for the equinoxes. So it's 364. 365 then speaks of him. After the year, he is taken. And notice how it says he walked with God, and after he had begotten Methuselah 300 years, he begot his sons and daughters. And so he walked with God, and then he wasn't. So we have all kinds of discussions about that. Sometimes we simply talk about the fact that God took him. Well, what does it mean he took him? Did he rip him off the earth? Or did they simply walk off together? And how did that happen? Well, that idea of took is going to be the idea we're going to have to realize when we talk about the fact that this sons of man, or sons of God, took daughters of men. Took, same word. Does it hold the same meaning? That's part of the things that I questioned and dealt with over a period of time. The impact of this book on Christianity was tremendous until about the 2nd or 3rd century, when some of the scholars began to say that's a Jewish work. Now, the Jews gave it up because it was a Christian work, and now the Christians are giving it up because the Jews wrote it. So nobody began to read it. So that's why it was never part of the Catholic Bible until later it was added, and it was added in the Apocrypha. Apocalyptic literature encapsulates the revelation of supernatural activity transmitted by or to a worthy being who carries the message of the final judgment. So apocalyptic writings speak of final days. That's what we need to remind ourselves of. Enoch is writing towards the final days, and what he's giving us is a roadmap of how to get there. So it comes when the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished. So we're really talking about the very end of days. That's what he's going for. So this is going to be writings that are going to speak to the end. Now, there was a rabbi named Gershom Scholem, who was probably in the 20th century, he was the great understander of Kabbalah. He was the great mystic that walked this earth. He lived from 1897 all the way to 1982. In fact, he took several books that we're going to talk about, or I'll probably just mention. Among the books that he makes connections with the Bible, with the Talmud, with all of the others, is the book that we call First and Second Enoch. And I'll tell you a little bit about Enoch, first, second, and third in a little bit. And he talks about the apocalypse of Abraham. And he also talks to us about what's called the Ma'aseh Merkavah, which are the works of the chariot. Because you see, there's two different ways that the Kabbalists work with the writings. One is it works with the chariot, and the other it works with the Heklot, the palace, dealing with the palaces or heaven. So if the writing deals with heaven, it's a Heklot. Ma'aseh is the idea of to build, to add to. So you're building yourself a chariot. Most of us, when we read the book of Ezekiel, the first chapter, we read it in a physical manner. But you see, the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel is a mystical writing. It's how we build a chariot to God. It's how we communicate with God. It's how we draw closer to God. And that's a whole writing in and of itself. But I don't have time. So we might go back to that. So we're going to have all of these writings. Now, the book of Enoch itself is really 5 little booklets. And by 5 little booklets, I mean, these are parchments that have been stitched together. So they did not necessarily have to be written by Enoch. In fact, there's a couple that we are sure weren't written by him that are going to be found in our stories. Now, the first one deals with the Watchers, and I'm going to talk about that last because I'm going to continue in talking about the Watchers. The first one is actually the second book. Now, the second book of Enoch is called the Similitudes. The Similitudes. It speaks of parables, and it speaks in parables. That's the thing that you have to understand. So there are a number of parables that he's going to deal with. And the emphasis is on the end of days, and it's emphasizing the blessing for the rich, or for the blessed, and the pain that will come upon those who are found to be the wicked. And he goes through that. This is the portion of the book that is most often taken into Christian understanding because it uses words like, Messiah, Son of Man, the Righteous One, the Elect One. All of those terms have been used to describe JC, but that's not who it's describing. It's entirely different. And I'm going to give you that answer later, but I just want you to understand that's what you're going to see. So again, as we're looking at all of these books, we're looking at something that's going to be seen 2 different ways. One by the Jewish people, one by the Christian people. Somewhere in between is where I stand. And so I'm trying to cull the 2 together and make it make sense. So the second book is just parables dealing with the end. The third book is called the Astronomical book. It deals with the astronomy. It deals with the sun, the moon, the stars, talking about how they got there, what they're like, all of the physical features that are there. It talks about the stars. It talks about the calendar, which is probably where the Book of Jubilees draws its information from, or Enoch drew his information from Jubilees, because they're both written at about the same time. So I can't tell you which one came first. But the Book of Jubilees deals with time. Remember, when I was teaching Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12, time was very significant because we were dealing with 70 years or 77s of years or 77s of sevens of years. So as we're going through this, we're going to find that there's a lot of things that it talks about. And so one of the things that's going to emerge from this is the fact that it talks about these men who believe in this astronomical calendar, which is solar, versus the lunar calendar, which is what Judaism follows today, were probably the Essenes, because the Essenes appear to have left Jerusalem, moved down to Qumran and other places around the country of Israel, because of the fact that there were the practices that were going on at the temple were not the practices that should have been going on. The high priest himself was not Jewish. He was more of a Greek. And so therefore we began to see a whole splitting of what was going on. Now the next book in there is called the Book of Dreams. And actually there was only 2 dreams in the book. So it's a very short book, but the 2 dreams, first one, Methuselah receives 2 dreams from God, talking with the watchers, understanding what the dreams are. The first one basically is a warning to his sons about the coming deluge. He talks to them about the flood and what's going to happen and how it will work. Now, the second one he's going to talk about is called the animal apocalypse. The animal apocalypse. For the longest time, I was wondering if he's talking about the animals that went on the boat. Then I read the section. It has nothing to do with that. If you were doing Daniel chapter 7, you remember how Daniel chapter 7 talks about the nations that are going to impact Israel? The lion, the bear, the leopard. You remember those, that the fourth unusual beast? Well, in the book of Enoch, Enoch begins to describe the nations of the world in the form of animals. And he classifies these nations. Some are kosher, some are non-kosher. So he's giving the people an understanding of what's going to happen in the chapter number 10, 11, and 12 when the nations begin to divide. That's where he's going with his information there. Now, some people say he's talking about something he shouldn't be talking about because he's interfering with what's going on the Temple Mount. Well, remember, if he's really Enoch, there was no Temple Mount. This is back before everything started. So we know he's writing in those days of the second temple, not the first. So he's more in the 2nd and 3rd century BC. So as we look at this, we're going to have to see a foundation bedrock of what the Jews should be understanding about their God and about worship. That's what he's talking to, and how people should, the good people, should react to that. Now, the last book is called the Book of Enoch, or the Epistle of Enoch. And so as that book, that's number 5. Book number 1 is the Watchers. So book number 5 is the epistle. And what he does here is he draws upon information that reminds us of righteousness and wickedness. And he spends a lot of time differentiating the groups, talking about what makes one righteous, what makes one of the other. He comes up with finally what's called the Apocalypse of Weeks, which seems to be very similar to what Daniel was talking about. Not the same, but very similar to that. Finally, the book that we started with is the book called The Watchers. And that's where I want to spend part of my focus. I've already gone a half hour, so I may not get through with all of this, but that's okay because I wasn't planning on being through with the story of the Nephilim tonight anyway. I think it's more important for you to understand the background of where this man is writing from. That's what I think is the most important. Once you have a background, an understanding, when I start talking to you and I pull back and go back to these places, it won't be foreign to you. Now, some of you have copies of my notes. So you have an opportunity to read my notes over and over again. And if anybody is interested in them, just send word to NETIV and it'll get word to me and I will send you copies. There's no sense hoarding what I know. It's I spread ignorance easily. So I just want you to understand what's going on and understand this is NETIV. This is a network that's built or designed to educate us. It's not here for socialization. It is here for education. And so I'm a teacher. That's what I was by trade. I am not a rabbi, but I spent my whole life teaching. And my favorite subject in teaching was history. It was the geography. It was all of those things that most people wanted to get through and turn off. But I find it fascinating because it lives out today, what's going on in those days past. So anyway, we're going to deal with a hero. So our hero is found in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1 to 5. So I want you to grab your Bible again, and I want you to go to Genesis chapter 6, 1 to 5. And we're going to look at that more closely because we've got to know what's going on here before we can really go anywhere else. Aren't you glad you got a Bible? Now, it may not be mine, but that's okay. As long as it has God's word in it, you can read it out of a paperback. So in chapter 6, it begins the following. And it came to pass when man began to increase upon the ground, and daughters were born to them. So notice when Adams, the word that man is Adam. So when the Adams were born, daughters were born. And so let me read the verse again. And it came to pass when Adam began to increase upon the ground, and daughters were born to them, the multiple Adams, the sons of the rulers, is how my book talks about it, saw the daughters of man were good, and they took themselves wives from whomever. Now, the sons of rulers is one of those phrases that my Bible uses, but it gives me an understanding that we're not really talking about just the sons of the rulers. Again, the Jewish people do not accept this book because it was accepted by the Christians. And so their understanding was that these sons of men or these rulers are actually princes and Jews and judges. That's how they interpret it. But if you really are going back to it, and we'll get further into it, they're really angels that he's talking about. Those are the watchers that came down with Daniel. So that's where we're at this particular point in time. So in our story then, it goes on to say, my spirit shall not contend evermore concerning man, since he is but flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Now, if you're reading the book of Jubilees, 120 years takes us from the days of man, which was Seth. We would go 120 Jubilee cycles, and you end up on October 6th, 2023. Isn't that amazing? Now, in the literal terms, you could say that they lived 120 years, but when you looked at the generations before the flood, they were living 8, 9, almost 1,000 years. And when you look at them after the flood, they're still living hundreds of years. Now, some people say, well, that 120, that talks about Moses. Moses lived 120 years. Well, it could have. But I find it fascinating that he uses the term man, and Seth was the first man that was created after Cain and Abel. And he is the progenitor of a lot of these people. So anyway, as I go on, verse 4 says, the Nephilim, Nephil, which is a singular, Nephilim is plural. The idea of Nephilim is the idea of fallen ones, one who falls, one who does not hold his place. That's what's going on here. And as you're looking at it, then he begins by saying, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And afterwards, when the sons of the rulers, these others, would consort with the daughters of men who would bear to them, they were mighty, who were from old, were men of devastation. It requires you to go back and look through the Talmud and some of the Midrashic writings in order to really get an understanding of what he's talking about. First off, if I don't have to honor the Jewish people and say that I can read this book and I won't go to hell, my understanding is that the angels came down. Do you remember reading, if you were a Christian, the book of Jude? Book of Jude has one chapter, but the book of Jude spends 3 verses talking about Enoch. Daughters of men, sons of God. That's who they talk about. Well, if the sons of God came down, they left their first estate, according to Jude. In other words, they divested themselves of their angelic being and became human. And in becoming human, they could now intermarry with humans. So you have angels who came down, and the angels having come down, having taken off their cloaks, have become human. They took wives. Not that they stole them, just as Abraham took his wife Sarah, just as Isaac took his wife Rebekah, just as Jacob took his wives. The word is took. So the angels didn't beat up anybody to get these women, but they decided that they were going to marry them. Now, in the process of marriage, as we're going through this, I want you to notice the fact that these characters now are going to produce the Nephilim that it talks about in the beginning of the verse. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. How'd they get there? They were birthed on the earth. It was when the angels procreated with the women that we created this new beast. Now, if you're speaking Greek, the word for Nephilim is cyclops, one-eyed. Goes back to Homer and the Odyssey. I don't know if you've gone through your Greek literature, just to give you some understanding. It's also the idea of there were giants. And there's going to be giants in the land when we get into the Joshua all the way up through David. But these Nephilim were fallen. Now, when I read you the story of Enoch's life, I read you from his father. And you remember his father's name? It was Jared. At the time, I didn't realize what I was naming my kid. But the name Jared is to descend. What descended during the days of Jared? The sons of God. They landed on, according to the writings in the book of Enoch, on Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain. And from there, they began to spread out. And so we begin to see an inkling of what's going on that's in the book for you to read, because I'm not going to read it all to you. But the understanding is this is important to know. This is important to know before we get started. How did we create Nephilim? I believe from the sons of God, who were angels, divesting themselves of their angelic spirit and becoming physically human. Now, there's a lot of consternation about size. And I can only tell you that it really poses a problem. There are bones that were discovered, and I can't remember where. Ross was talking about it earlier. The bones of Noah's wife, Naamah. Naamah, according to her skeletal structure, if that is her, she was 18 feet tall. 18 feet. She was from the line of Cain. Noah, obviously, was from the line of Seth. Was Seth short, or was Seth just as tall? We don't know. That part's not told to us in any scriptures that I can find. But 18 feet is rather tall. But yet we call the Nephilim, when it's all said and done, giants. How much bigger were they than Naamah? Some estimates were as tall as 4 stories of a building. Some were even taller. They were huge and had a tremendous appetite. And so that leads us to another set of stories. Now remember, they divested themselves of their spiritual nature, but they did not divest their mind of what they knew. And so what was happening on the earth during the days of Noah was the earth was becoming more and more corrupt. That's when God said, I can't take any more. Now, what caused him to do that? 3 things are pointed out in the book of Enoch. 1, weapons. You see, before the angels came down, there were no weapons. Nobody made anything out of metal. In fact, ladies, there was no jewelry. Metal was not used. Not only that, ladies, there was no eyeshadow. There was none of the cosmetics that we use today, but there were when the giants came to be. We began to see the fact that they have weapons for war. They also have items for seduction. They began to change how people looked at one another. The final straw comes if you happen to read the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, when you learn about all the possibilities of sorcery. You see, they brought with them understandings of the stars and how you can read the stars and all of the understandings of horoscopes. They understood how to read dried bones. They learned how to do all kinds of sorcery. All of that was a part of their story. Imagine that. Righteous Enoch enters into the story by agreeing to petition God on behalf of these angels that had lost their first estate. Now, they lost their first estate, and I'll go back through it next time. They lost their first estate because they wanted to cohabit with these women. But they knew ahead of time, if they did, their life expectancy and their end result were not in their favor. They would end up in a place that was lower than hell. Dark, dark, dark. Totally heated. In other words, they were in the midst of a black fire with the inability to see anyone or anything. Now, according to the book of Enoch, they're still there. Still buried, still covered, still there, screaming. I remember hearing the stories of people who have gone out in the desert or in the wilderness trip, where they've heard sounds from holes in the ground of screaming and weeping. Some say that's them. But according to Jewish understanding, that's only Gehenna. This is lower than that. In fact, they call it Tartarus, place of darkness. So we go through this whole idea. Now, according to one of the people I was reading, her name was Anita Yoshiko Reed. She explains the fact that the nature of the giants contaminated by mingling with the spirit and the flesh of a human. And upon the expiration of their physical bodies, their spirits roamed the earth. Hello. Their spirits roamed the earth. In other words, their evil did not dissipate from this earth. They simply continued in the form of demons, which is going to be recorded in the second book of Enoch. Goes on to say, after that, it says, the spirits roam, or what would be known biblically as the idea of evil spirits roaming the earth as demons, carrying on in corruption and corrupting humankind by whispering in their ears, talking to their minds. Rebellion. Now, scholars are going to point out the focus of this whole thing should be on the origin of sin. It's not, although sin becomes very important because we find out why it increased so fast and why today sin has multiplied in such a hurry. Enoch influenced a lot of books in the New Testament. And like I said, it influenced the book of Jude. I want to read a portion of the book of Jude for you and show you the difference between the way the Jewish writing is and the way it is written in Christian Bibles. In the Jewish Bible, and the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, Tartarus, bound with everlasting chains of judgment on their great day. Now he goes on to say in the book of Jude, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them, seeing the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone. Remember how I read that in the first 8 verses of the book of First Enoch? Only there it called it millions. He goes on to say in this text, and to convict all of them of the ungodly, all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Now, Jude, again, behold, he will arrive with 10 million of his saints. That's according to Enoch. But when you read it in the Hebrew, or in the New Testament, you're going to find out the word he isn't there, but the word the Lord is, helping them to understand that this is about Jesus. It's not. He goes on to say in several other places, as I pick it up, Enoch's book can be found, I've already said, in the book of Jubilees. It can also be found in the book of Baruch, which is Jeremiah's second writer. He's his ghost writer, remember. It's also written during the Second Temple period, and it speaks in the book of Esdras. Esdras is, again, the idea of Ezra, the priest Ezra. And the Jewish apocalypse that was in that time, the Assumption of the Moses, which is also written at that time, and the tale of the 12 patriarchs, which is in Enoch's book. Lots of things are going to be found in here. Lots of things that are going to be told, and I'll have to spend time as we go along talking you through some of the stories that we're going to get to. But again, Gershom Scholem said this is the premier book behind the Sefer Yetzirah as a book that begins the real study of Kabbalah. That's where this is all beginning. And it deals with the Merkavah, the works of the chariot, the works of going towards God. That's what this whole book is about. We want to move towards God. We want to keep in mind our righteousness will help us in the end. Evil will not get us anywhere, but it will take us somewhere. So we've got all of these things written so far. So the mainstream church has changed its mind about the book, and so has everyone else. Now, as we're going through this, there's going to actually be two more books of Enoch. Enoch has written 3 books. No, he didn't. One was written in the 2nd century BCE. One was written at the temple period, and one was written 300 years later. But all of them are going to cover basic premises of what the Christian church has adopted and accepted. All of them are going to lead us in a direction. The book of Enoch is going to lead us through the idea of demons. It's going to be the first book that we're going to find that actually calls them demons that we're going to deal with. And so we're going to see things that are there that we haven't seen before. So it's going to take me a while to get you to understand some of the things that are happening. The book of Mark talks about clean or unclean, talks about pure or impure spirits. Well, those are demonic spirits. In the book of Enoch, in chapter 10, 13 to 15, he writes, and those days they shall be led off to the fire, or to the abyss of fire, and to the torment, and to the prison in which they shall be confined forever, and destroy all the spirits of the reprobate and the children of the watchers, because of the harm that they have caused human beings at that point in time. I want to stop right now. I've only got 3 pages left of my notes to read, but I want to stop, because if I go too far, as Lori has already told me, I've taught more than 7 new things to you people, enough to keep you busy for a couple hours if you want to go through my notes, or if you want to go backtrack and look online. There are several good YouTube videos that I would recommend. There are a lot of junk ones. I have been reading and watching for close to 2 days now, so I'm tired of looking at them. But there are some good ones, and I'll recommend you some. Right now, they're not in my head. They fell out somewhere. Marshall Taylor was one of them. Marshall Taylor has 3 good videos. One deals with the 10 main points of the first book of Enoch. That one it's only 19 minutes. It's an easy read or easy listen. But again, it's a very Christianized version of it, but he covers 10 important facts. So that's where you can go with that. The other fellow was 6'7", and I can't think of his name. But anyway, questions, thoughts, anything that I can give you for help.